Welcome to today's webinar in our series on the future of AI in education and training. I am Lewis Johnson, the overall host of the series. We are going to be talking today about the impact of COVID-19 on learners and how AI can support them. If you're not familiar, this is part of an overall webinar series. If you look on the screen there, www.alelo.com/AIEd. You can go there to get recordings of previous webinars, and we will also post a recording of this webinar as soon as we are done. So I've got a great set of panelists joining me today. James, would you introduce yourself, please?
I'm James Lester. I'm a faculty member in computer science at North Carolina State University, where I direct the Center for Educational Informatics.
And Jack?
I'll wait till my intro slide.
Okay. Carolyn?
I'm Carolyn Rosé. I'm a professor of language technologies and human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon University and co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Computer-Supported Collaborative Learning.
Thank you. And I'm Lewis Johnson, President, CEO of Alelo, past president of the International AI and Education Society. I've worked in this area for a number of years. I've worked with these collaborators for a number of years. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So to set the context of what we're going to be talking about, I just want to make sure everyone is aware of the global impact that COVID-19 has had on education systems. So at this point, over 1 billion students are affected by school closures. At the height of the lockdown, there were 1.6 billion students who were kicked out of class, and half of those students did not have access to a computer. So this had a big impact on learning and is going to continue to have an impact going forward. Now, when the classes were first closed, when the lockdowns first started occurring, then what a lot of schools, institutions did was quickly move their classes online, record their lectures as videos, for example, to set up Zoom virtual classrooms, what's known as Zoom School. And we've seen these operate for a few months now, and we see some of the limitations, particularly from programs that started in face-to-face and then had to quickly transition to online. And here, for example, is a recent quote from a student at a college in California, and I think really speaks to the problem that we currently face. So he said, "We basically have to teach ourselves. It's like paying tuition to watch YouTube videos." So the question is, what is it that's been lost in this transition, and how can AI help to recover for that loss? And so what are some of the impacts that we've observed up to this point? Well, one thing that COVID-19 has done is it's made much more obvious the economic disparities among learners and among school systems. And that has really exacerbated the differences in terms of learning outcomes, because now there is unequal access to learning resources. And also it has a negative impact on many students. Now, some students do just fine in the new online environment, but some of them have experience of loneliness, isolation. They feel like they're cut off from the community of learners. And as a result, for many students, their motivation can suffer. So, but fortunately, there are things that AI can do to help to redress these problems. AI can be used to create learning experiences that are engaging and motivating and address the motivational needs of each learner, helps everybody to get re-engaged. AI technologies can help to narrow skill and achievement gaps that are now widening by providing personalized learning to the students that have greatest need for it. It used to be the case that AI technologies required high-powered computers and there was limited availability for them. But now we're beginning to see AI-based technologies that can be made available to students wherever they are, even in areas with limited digital resources. And we're also starting to see AI technologies helping to overcome the sense of loneliness and isolation by fostering connections between students and teachers and fostering connections between students. And finally, these technologies are now available so that they can address these problems at scale to address the global need, this need that learners around the world have for assistance. So we'll talk about each of these areas in turn. James, why don't you start about the topic of motivating and engaging learners using AI technologies.
Thanks, Louis. So for a long time, the field of AI in education has been deeply interested in issues of motivation and engagement. I think really when the field began, there was much more of a stronger, more kind of cognitivist focus on the work. And yet, for, on the order of 2 decades now, there's been a lot of interest in developing technologies that not only create learning experiences that are effective, but also deeply engaging learners. And it turns out, as we'll see on the next slide, that this question of engagement has really come to the fore. It's really astonishing to recognize this incredible kind of education reality that's now befallen us. There's one projection that by the fall of 2020, we will see impacts both on reading and math. For example, it's anticipated that about 1/3 of expected progress will vaporize for reading, and even more than that, half for math. There are really significant disparities in computing access. There are questions of connectivity. A very, very important one are losses of interactions with teachers. And we're not seeing these effects kind of across the board evenly meted out. In fact, one example is that there are roughly, if you compare wealthy school districts with low-income school districts, twice as being more likely to have live teaching during these COVID times that we live in, which was really astonishing. And we'll see some quickly some examples of how these differences manifest, beginning with the next slide. There's a really significant difference if you compare high-income students from those in the middle classes to those that are at the bottom. So just thinking about what it means to not have access to a digital device, a laptop, an iPad, some other tablet-based computing device, a phone, for example, or missing high-speed internet and what the effects of that are, which are really substantial. And of course, it varies dramatically over these income levels. On the next slide, we also note that there is an enormous difference in teachers engaging in online instruction. So we have kind of 2 data points here, 2 snapshots. One is in March, one is in April. And if we consider the more wealthy neighborhoods, this analysis was done by zip code. We see that there were some differences early on, but you know, if you start looking not only over time, but also going through decreases in wealth levels, there is an enormous difference for the least wealthy group, the group that really probably needs it the most, between those where teachers were engaged and those where they were not. And then one of the major impacts that we'll see on the next slide is a word that many of us have not seen or heard for a long time, which is truancy. But that manifests these days in the delivery of education, whatever form that takes during the pandemic, as students just not connecting. So literally not logging in, literally not making any contact with their teacher or school. Surprisingly, there are actually some percent of these, 12% for the wealthy students, but it is astonishing that if you look at those where they really are not students of means, it's almost a third of students are not connecting with their teachers, with their schools. They have in essence, we hope temporarily, but nonetheless, they have in essence dropped out. So these are very, very serious concerns. And we'll see one more example with math. So this is on the next slide, this is a very nice visualization of changes in math participation in an online math program that's used nationally. The more red there is, the less progress there's been. In fact, it's actually not sort of a lack of progress, it's actually negative progress, regress really. And if you compare the high income students with the middle income students with the low income students across the country, you see the sea of red really increasing as you go down the income categories. Which is especially concerning because, again, it's almost a Matthew effect of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and it's terribly concerning. But the good news that I think that we all bring is that, in fact, AI can really make a difference in making an impact on these visualizations, and of course ultimately on the students themselves. And we're going to talk briefly about why that's the case. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll ask ourselves these two rhetorical questions. Well, gosh, what's needed given these really serious concerns? Well, we need engaged learning environments that can motivate well, probably do so adaptively, and we need them to be able to operate at very broad scales. And so you'll see examples coming up, Lewis and Carolyn and Jack, with some examples of this. And the second question is, are we starting from scratch? And delightfully, the answer is no, we're not starting from scratch. Yes, there is an AI in Education research foundation that's substantial, really focused on engagement. There's a lot of work to do, but we have a great place to begin with. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll recognize the fact that for many years now, really on the order of a couple of decades, many research labs and industry have been looking at these very promising technologies that integrate game-based learning and AI for what sometimes are called intelligent game-based learning environments. But they don't have to be games. They can be simulations. They can be virtual agents in many kinds of settings. But what we've begun to develop a pretty sizable empirical basis for is understanding how does engagement work. And for example, a kind of classic question is, does engagement need in any way to be oppositional to learning effectiveness? And of course, the answer is that it needn't be, and there's a certain craft and a science to designing learning environments that are principled, that are designed both, again, to be effective and to be engaging. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll see a couple of settings where these kinds of questions have been and are being very actively investigated. The first of these is in the classroom. So there's a good amount of effort going on, and I'm going to mention a project that's collaborative with my colleagues Cindy Mello Silver and Krista Glazewski and Tom Brush at Indiana University. This is actually a constellation of a couple of projects, and thanks to Carolyn for serving on the advisory board for this work, where we're looking at collaborative game-based learning in the classroom. And you can kind of think of it as an overlay accompanying that, trying to imagine what sorts of tools will be most helpful for teachers in being able to conduct collaborative learning in the classroom in the most effective way. So teaching is challenging enough, but doing it collaboratively poses really significant challenges. This is a problem that we've been looking at, developing AI tools for classroom orchestration. That is a really, really interesting, very important problem that we've been making some nice progress on. But of course, the game changer here is that we're not in the classroom anymore. We're sidelined in a really interesting way that we'll talk about in a moment. So this is the formal setting. Now let's take a look at an informal setting. We're doing kind of an analogous project. This is part of a research initiative that's gone on for something like 7 or so years now. Working in the museum setting, looking at engagement of visitors. So this particular project is looking at what does it mean to have behavioral engagement, emotional engagement, cognitive engagement of visitors. And these are very core issues in visitor studies research that museums and the informal science education museum community is engaged in. Great progress going on here. I will mention that just fortuitously, we happen to, for both of these projects, have done data collects just before the shutdown. So these two projects have provided an enormous trove of data for us to work on. But really, in some ways, the more pressing question, if we can go to the next slide, is how can we take what we're learning from not just those two projects, which are really exemplars, but from those two lines of investigation that the whole AI ed community has been engaged in, looking at issues of motivation and engagement, both in classrooms on the formal side and in museums and science centers on the informal side. And because we have really been studying these questions for a long time now, collectively. We've got some, I think, both kind of evidence-based insight and kind of the know-how that comes along with that to begin thinking about what does it mean to create these same kinds of engaging learning experiences at home. And kind of as a surprise to us, starting really in April and in earnest in May, we've begun looking at these questions of how do you study this in the home. And it's a really both significant challenge, but I have to say very exciting time because the opportunity for impact of home-based learning, as I think we'll see from the other speakers coming up as well, is really enormous, and let's see what kinds of things we're going to be able to do in this the next frontier, which is actually home.
And so the good news is that these technologies are making their way into the home, and it's I'd say overall working fairly well. So I'll give you a little bit of experience with Alelo, our N-Skill English platform, which uses AI avatars to help people practice, improve their spoken English skills. And this is something which now students, since they've had to transition home, they are able to use at home and quite effectively. One thing that has been really interesting to see in the COVID-19 environment is that personalized learning is much more important and is changing in some respects, because we see students who are going to be away from class for a more extended period of time. So we see greater need on one hand for remediation, helping students to get back up to the level where they're supposed to be when they come back to class, and also skill recovery, that because some students, they may have had good language skill in the past, but then because they haven't had much opportunity to practice, it's tended to decay. And so they need technologies to help to recover their skills. And so that's been a key focus of ours at this point. And part of this, key of this, is providing analytics on student performance to the learners so they can see how well they're doing and are motivated to improve, as well as providing analytics to the teachers so that teachers can see which students are progressing well, which students are struggling, which students are not making progress. So this can help teachers to focus their attention on the students that need the most help. So what we've seen in the case of N-Skill is that initially it was used primarily in a blended learning context. Students would use it in a computer lab, and then they would continue to practice at home. But now, of course, home is the dominant vehicle, and so delivery of the platform on mobile phones, mobile devices, has been extremely important. And we've really seen that as students are using the platform on mobile devices, that correlates well with improvement in performance. Also, we combine this, or actually our instructors who use N-Skill discovered that this was a very effective approach, is to combine this with using WhatsApp so that students can actually record on their device speaking English and then sending those recordings back to their instructors. So the students found that very useful. The teachers find it very helpful, and we found them helpful as well. The teachers forwarded some of these to me. I'll just play a little bit here so you get a sense of what I'm talking about.
Hello, my name is Jenitzia Martinez, and I'm going to talk to you about my experience using Alelo. I started to using Alelo like 3 months ago.
So we can tell from these videos that students have different levels of language proficiency, but they all talk about how being able to practice on their own is very helpful, and also that it helps them to build self-confidence. And when we talk about the issue of motivation in learning, as I see it, that's closely connected with the issue of self-confidence. That if students have a sense of self-efficacy, they're going to be much more inclined to engage in the learning activity. And this is something that we see in a number of AI-driven learning applications. So, and we have some experience now in different countries around the world. We have a lot of learners across Latin America, where we find actually that often the connectivity that students have at home is better than what they have in the schools. But there are areas where we still want to expand further. And Jack Mostow has had a lot of experience, for example, in delivering AI-driven technology in Africa, and will tell us a little bit about some of the problems he's encountered and how he worked to overcome them.
Hi, I'm Jack Mostow. I'm Emeritus Research Professor of Robotics, Machine Learning, Language Technologies, and Human-Computer Interaction at Carnegie Mellon University. Lewis asked that I speak about technologies available to students everywhere. So I made a teeny little change and talked about technologies that are not available everywhere. Next. Here they are, just go through them.
Just a sec here. Okay, I'm clicking through. Do we get all of them? Yeah.
Right, I'm going to talk about what happens when these technologies are not as available as they are to us, and some workarounds in RoboTutor. One more next, please. So RoboTutor was a $1 million finalist in the Global Learning X Prize. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it was a $15 million competition to address the shortage of teachers in developing countries by developing an open source Android tablet app to teach basic literacy and numeracy to children in developing countries. The grand prize went to the teams that achieved the highest total learning gains from pre to post test in a massive 15-month-long controlled study of the Swahili version in 168 villages in Tanzania. Next. So I'm going to go through each of these technologies that's available to us, but not so much in developing countries. So we're used to assuming that we have reliable electricity. The reality in places like Tanzania, especially outside the major cities, is that electricity has limited availability. Many of these villages had no electricity, and the voltage level fluctuates, which can wreak havoc with delicate equipment. Next. Obvious workaround is batteries, but batteries have to be recharged. So XPRIZE provided a solar-powered recharging station to all of the villages that were participating in the study. Next. Internet. We're used to good internet. The reality there is that internet access is limited, slow, or absent altogether. These villages did not have internet access. The workaround, at least in part, is that the apps cannot be web-based. Many apps are web-based, especially for mobile computing devices, but RoboTutor had to not depend on an internet connection, except to send back data, which I'll get to in a moment. Next. Wi-Fi. We're used to good Wi-Fi. The reality of Wi-Fi there, we're talking about local Wi-Fi, limited coverage, limited bandwidth, frequent outages. For example, I wondered why I wasn't getting data back from one of our beta sites, and it turned out it was raining, and when it was raining, the Wi-Fi didn't work. Next. The workaround here is to operate on the tablet, the client side, without relying on the local server. I didn't tell you that XPRIZE provided as part of the solar power recharging station, FTP server for each village, so that tablets could upload their log data to the server, and then once a week when the field staff came to, I call it milking the machines, copy the accumulated data off onto a portable hard drive. They would send it by motorcycle, which is how people get around in rural Tanzania, to someplace that actually had internet access, which I like to call civilization. Next. We're used to good, cheap, strong, powerful computers. The reality there, tablets were unknown, unheard of in these villages. And in general, computing devices are scarce, low end, and shared. Next, so we had to work around by supporting shared use. Here is how we did it. Next. Next, thank you. Good, okay, so kids had to be able to share a tablet because we could not afford, unlike XPRIZE, which got 8,000 tablets donated by Google, we couldn't afford to provide every kid at our beta sites with their own tablet. So they had to share, but we had to keep each kid's profile in order for RoboTutor to adapt to the individual. We needed a way that children could enroll and log in without requiring assistance from a literate adult. If you can tap on the video, you'll see what the login looked like. And she's in. This had to go through a number of design iterations. An earlier version, for example, did not have the animal picture next to each kid's photo. You probably couldn't see it close enough there. We did that because the kids were not skilled photographers, so the selfies they took were indistinguishable sometimes because they were not lit or they were backlit. Whereas we knew that the animal photos would be distinguishable, we let kids pick their own animals. The funniest part was the 3-second selfie video in which they narrated their name. They loved that so much that they kept re-enrolling, which defeated the purpose of having them do it. And after a lot of head scratching, we modified the user interaction design so that we let them take selfies just recreationally, even when they're just logging in. Next. Sensors. We have the luxury of good sensors of lots of modalities and physiological signals and all sorts of things which are as accurate as they can be for modern technology, and typically they're being used in a controlled environment. Our reality was unreliable, and specifically I'll focus on speech recognition here. We didn't have physiological signals, just what the tablet gets. And the environment was noisy. Next. So what did we do about it? Well, for one thing, we applied that sensing technology, speech recognition, selectively only to highly predictable speech like oral reading of a known text. It had to degrade gracefully. A problem with inaccuracy in speech recognition is false rejections, which can be very frustrating. So we implemented a 2-strike rule. If a word got rejected twice, RoboTutor would just supply it, speak it, and go on. And we also had to have a fallback. So if RoboTutor didn't seem to hear the student for some reason, they could just tap to hear a word. Now we'll have a video of a child reading, whom you can see in the upper right-hand corner. Play video, please. Please read aloud.
Na kunguru walikuwa marafiki sana hapo awali.
So she got a second try.
Ingawaje
Here's the fallback.
tabia zao zilikuwa tofauti sana kwa njia nyingine.
This girl is reading word by word, leaving very little cognitive headroom for comprehension.
Fisi na kunguru walikuwa marafiki sana hapo awali, ingawaje tabia zao zilikuwa tofauti sana kwa njia nyingine.
So RoboTutor plays this marvelously expressive, fluent adult narration. Next. We're used to tech support. I'm on the phone practically every day with tech support at Carnegie Mellon. I think they recognize, I'm sure they recognize my voice. And in a school, there's not only technical support, but educational support. In American schools, there's teachers in the classroom, and we could rely on them to assess what level the student's at. Our reality in Tanzania was assistance like that was scarce or absent or provided by somebody who is not expert, maybe not even literate. In schools, and these villages did not have schools, but in places like Tanzania and large parts of Africa, the teachers overburdened, undertrained, absent because perhaps they're not getting paid, or there's no teacher, like in the villages that we were in. Next. That meant that we could not rely on somebody who is a tech expert to show kids how to use things. So RoboTutor had to prompt the kids, in Swahili, of course, on what to do, and it had to have some way of pointing at things. We're used to, if the computer highlights something on the screen, we view that, we interpret it as a form of pointing. That's a high-tech Western cultural convention, which was absent there. And so instead we had to have an animated finger pointing. When we needed to show external context, we had a video in order to show kids how to use the tutor, because the field investigators found that kids had to be taken by the hand and shown how to do things. So we couldn't do that, but we could show them video. We couldn't rely on a teacher being there to place them. So we relied on automated assessment, both for initial placement at the initial level and then promotion to the next level. Next. This is Filippo. We won't play the video, I think, because in the interest of time, right? But Filippo is from Tanzania. There's RoboTutor, and in the video, he shows what to do, and he goes through the process that we need kids to be able to follow. Next. If you're interested in more information, please see robotutor.org. There's a magnificent video made by XPRIZE, which is very good at that sort of thing, showing RoboTutor being used in the field. And the Learning at Scale conference will be held in cyberspace, August 12th to 14th. This is the paper that we'll be presenting there on what we learned from the gigabytes of data that we collected. Oh, one last thing. We would like to deploy RoboTutor widely where it can help. We need money. So if you know somebody who has some, have them contact me. Thank you.
Okay, so Carolyn, you'd like to talk a little bit about your work in fostering connections among students?
Yes, I would love to. And I am requesting remote control.
And there you are, and there you go.
Okay, so let's hope this works. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about two opportunities related to the coronavirus, one of which is about students learning in their homes, but the other is as we look forward to coming back to the schools. So the area of computer-supported collaborative learning is all about supporting students learning from one another online. And what I have seen over the decade and a half of time that I've been involved in this field is that for expedience, oftentimes the push is for individual learning. It takes additional infrastructure to make collaborative learning work well. And so as classrooms are transitioning more to online so that students can learn from home, it's even more the case that what's being undercut is interaction between students. And the fear is that even as we're becoming more aware of the detriment that students feel from being isolated, that we'll just continue that as students transition back to the classroom. So even as we take steps to recover our face-to-face lives in order to be safe, we might really overemphasize or maybe just emphasize, but without thought to its implications on the social level, the safety concerns, which emphasize distancing. And distancing requirements make it even more challenging for students to collaborate with one another. And this raises new questions about how we can support collaboration while still supporting social distancing. How can we do those things simultaneously so that our schools don't just become as isolating as the current situation when students return? So I want to talk a little bit about the value that students can get from one another that I think really emphasizes why it is that the whole area of computer-supported collaborative learning is a key area for learning. And that is that we find that students can gain as much as a whole letter grade, pre to post test gains, from having another student with them while they're working. For many reasons. It's more motivating, but they can also get a different perspective that other student can provide some scaffolding. And this has been seen to be true even in the absence of support to scaffold that collaboration. But the whole field is about how to scaffold that collaboration. And many, many results show that the benefit from collaboration with other students can be increased with effective scaffolding. So the question is, how can we make what we know about how to support students in using one another as learning resources available in this time where we're experiencing so keenly the isolation? So for the past 15 years, so before that actually, I have been working for over 2 decades in the area of tutorial dialogue systems, using dialogue agents as one form of artificial intelligence to support learning. And initially, I was working on agents that were posed as tutors. But based on my observation of how much more rich interactions are between humans than between humans and computer agents, I turned my focus to using those conversational agents not primarily as the ones who are doing the instruction, but as catalysts for supporting the dynamic between students. So what you see here on the screen is just one of very many interfaces, client interfaces, where students are sitting at their computer, but they're interacting with other students who are also sitting at their computer, which could be at home or it could be in a classroom. And the students in many of our applications are interacting with one another through chat, which you can see here. And in this foundational study, and consistent with what I said on the previous slide, when we looked in comparison to students working alone in the environment on the same activity without support, If they worked either with a partner student or with a computer agent, they learned about 1 letter grade more, but when they had both, they learned 1 1/4 letter grades more. And this was from 15 years ago. This is an old study. And since then, we have learned a lot about designing the agents to be better supporters of the interaction. But specifically with the issue of isolation, this was very much on our radars during the time of the MOOCs. And a lot of what I'm hearing, both in terms of equity and in terms of isolation and in terms of disengagement, were the same topics we talked about over and over with the rise of the MOOCs. And especially this exponential drop-off of students, that they would come into a MOOC and they would stay on average no more than 3 weeks, but there was this exponential drop-off. And so in a lot of our work, we were, massive open online course. Very sorry that I didn't define that. We were looking at how to integrate collaborative reflections into these massive open online courses so that they wouldn't be purely solitary learning experiences. And in this research, we were investigating, using survival model techniques, the impact that experiencing a collaborative activity with the real human would have on the rate of drop-off. And we saw significant slowdowns of drop-off resulting from the experience of a collaboration. In our most successful study, a reduction of 70% in the probability of dropout by the next time point. So over the years, we have been developing tools to help people to introduce these collaborative activities into their online instruction, but also a series of design principles that help to understand how do you use these agents best to support interaction and therefore learning. And you can see just some of those principles here on this slide, but also a reference to the architecture, the Bazaar architecture, which makes it possible to connect up these dialogue agents through a chat into virtually any online environment. In our more recent work, we're starting to think about what happens after we're coming out of our homes and going back into places like the classroom. And now all of a sudden, it becomes such a focus. How is it that we can do this safely? And so how do we observe social distancing in these places? And if you remember the classroom, a slide from the first slide in this talk, you saw how distant the students were from one another. And there's this worry that classrooms will just be even more solitary experiences than they've been. On the other hand, when students come together and they start to work together and they engage with one another, they tend to move closer to one another, and this threatens the social distancing. And in that case, it could be seen as risky to introduce these collaborative activities. And so we're looking at how can we use virtual agents like the one you see in this slide to monitor what's happening in the room, to use the same strategies that we've been using in chat environments to support collaboration, but at the same time watching for social distancing and just nudging people apart so that we can balance these two. And we have a video, you can look at it. If you don't want to type that whole number, just search for the CMU LTI space on Vimeo. If you want to know more about the technical details.
Or look in the chat window so you can just copy it and paste it.
Yes, thank you, Jack. That was great. For anyone who wants to play around with these ideas in their classroom, in their office, the technical details of how we hooked all this up are in a demo abstract for SIGDial, which you can get online. And I just want to point out, we developed this really as an infrastructure for doing this kind of research, both for the purpose of COVID-19, but also just in order to think about how to extend collaborative learning activities more into our everyday lives. And so the architecture itself is very flexible in terms of how you can use sensors to get the information about what's going on in a collaborative setting. And so you can see here some of the sensors we have in our room, but we actually had to do some reconfiguration because of COVID-19. Face recognition, for example, has been affected by masks, not surprisingly. But the key thing here is how we can use the same architecture for bringing dialogue agents into a collaborative setting in this 3D world. Because we want to be able to leverage everything that we've been doing so far and have learned. And also to make it possible to develop activities that could be used either online or face-to-face, holding everything constant. And what has allowed that is an open source package developed by Microsoft called the Platform for Situated Intelligence that allows us to take in these multiple sensor streams, integrate them together synchronized, and pass it into our architecture for managing the collaboration. And here, rather than an agent that communicates with a chat room through chat, our virtual human can interact with students through eye gaze, gesture, and use of personal names. And again, you can see this in the video. The Bazaar architecture is available through the Open Simon Toolkit if you're interested, and please also reach out to us for collaboration. The final thing I just want to mention briefly is that we are very interested in being able to support substantial project-based work in classrooms. And we've been doing a lot of work, especially in software development, because we not only want to do it in classrooms, but we're also looking forward to supporting learning in the workplace. And so we have been integrating our collaborative support into cloud-based IDEs like you see here, where students and even software engineers can work together collaboratively on programming projects, but they can communicate with each other through chat, and in that chat environment, the dialogue agent can offer support for the collaboration. We've been working on design principles specifically for how to integrate collaboration into large project-based courses, especially technical courses, especially ones that have team-based projects. And so what we have learned over semesters of a design study, you can find in this recently accepted article in Information and Learning Sciences. And now I will return control.
Thanks. Okay, so we have some time now for Q&A. If anyone has any questions, type them in the chat window and we'll be happy to address them. And any questions that we don't cover here are email addresses of all the panelists, so feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Let me follow up with an early point of discussion. So we saw in Jack's presentation of all of the technical limitations that have to be addressed by delivering AI-driven systems in remote areas in Africa. But these similar issues arise to lesser, greater degrees in many countries, including the United States and other developed countries. And wondering who of the panelists who have been looking at these issues of how to provide technology in a resource-limited context. Well, Carolyn, go ahead.
I guess what I'd like to point out is, and I think that's true of the work that all of us have been doing over the decades, that it isn't just about the technology, it's about what we've learned about the support that students need. And oftentimes it is possible to create a really stripped down version of that. So if you look at the field of collaborative learning, for example, a lot of the older work or the not specifically computer supported work used very simple technologies for scaffolding collaborations very effectively by giving students 3x5 cards with little, sentence starters. But you could say like, oh, well, what's a sentence starter? Well, there was a lot of thinking and research that went into crafting roles and structuring of activities and ways of trying to prompt people to talk. And so how you go about doing that doesn't have to use artificial intelligence per se. I think we can do some things better with AI, but in the absence of being able to do that, we're not left with zero, because the good work in our field is about what do we learn about how people learn and what support they need. And if we have to be creative about how we apply that, I think we can do it.
I'd like to build on that in a computational thinking project that we're working on. So this is a project that's been, it's really a series of 2 projects that has been going roughly about 7 years. And for the first time in this, in the history of this work, we're suddenly thrust into doing it at home. So computational thinking is challenging for a particularly interesting reason that's a little bit unique to it, which is that oftentimes, this is a middle school CT intervention, oftentimes teachers are not particularly comfortable with CT because they just don't happen to have the background. But they're still nevertheless incredibly important. Now, if you remove that resource of motivation, encouragement, expertise, even if it's very new expertise, it still makes it really challenging. And so we're in the middle of creating a new version. It's called the Engage CT learning environment, a new version of this that has an enormous number of scaffolds built into it so that it can, we'll see, be effective in the home setting. So I have the same sense as Carolyn that really it's a matter of support. As Jack said, there are these issues of technical support, but there are also issues of pedagogical support that'll, I think, make or break these kinds of interventions.
I want to put in a plug for work by my colleague Amy Ogun, very interesting project in the Ivory Coast. And in fact, her student, Michael Mostow, who focused on that work, is doing his thesis defense on Wednesday at 9:30 Eastern time. And I'm going to paste in the Zoom link for anybody who wants to attend. And let's see here, right. And I will post it to everybody, not just to Carolyn, which is what I did the first time by mistake. There's a Zoom link, and I won't take your time to type more, but they looked in the Ivory Coast, and the hallmark of Amy's work is to look at the cultural context in which education technology gets used and co-design. So she looked at a literacy application that runs on feature phones. Feature phones are much simpler than smartphones, but much more widespread. Almost some very high percentage of people has them. And they designed in a role for parents who could not read to help their children acquire literacy through this very low-tech application delivered via the feature phone. So Michael will be speaking about that and about a widespread strike that had a lot of the same effects as COVID did, and how he is managing to pull off the PhD out of it anyway, despite the disruption of a lot of plans.
Question came in if any of the panelists could talk about specific issues they've encountered in the US about relating to limited access to technology. Most of our experience actually is overseas, so I don't, there's not a lot I could say about that, but any other panelists like to respond to that?
I guess I would say that there's this very, very great set of differences between, and actually my comments touched on this earlier, between very high income school districts and low income school districts. So for a long time now, we've really focused on working with the low end technology. So which is what the low-income school districts typically have. An interesting development over the last maybe 3 or 4 years is that we're starting to see pretty prevalent use of Chromebooks. So that's not the same as a high-end MacBook Pro. But on the other hand, it's still a pretty reliable platform, which I would imagine could be quite different than the kinds of things that Jack was describing. Nevertheless, I feel like it's an important, if not critical, design decision up front to ensure that all of the software runs on what's likely to be prevalent in the classroom. And that typically means designing down rather than designing up.
Carolyn?
The one tiny little addition is, I think something that was not nearly on my radar as much before the pandemic was rural America, which may not be low income, but there are many big places in this country that don't have good internet, and you can't even buy it if you have a lot of money. So I've been living out in the countryside during this time, and I'm just shocked at the fact that you can't even buy Fios. It just isn't available. And satellite internet goes down when it rains, or at least really slows down, and it affects you. And it makes me realize, I didn't realize how different it would be in rural America for those kids, but it is. And I think that it just doesn't, we don't expect that. And we think about SES, but we don't think about the fact that huge chunks of this country are in the country.
I'm not sure how directly relevant this is, but before RoboTutor, I spent 25 years getting computers to listen to children read using something called Project Listen's Reading Tutor in schools. And we learned a lot of lessons about what affects usage of technology in schools. Reading Tutor kept logs so we could tell how much there was. And it had a lot to do with teachers. So, for example, usage was much more consistent in pull-out labs than in classrooms, even though teachers preferred to have the tutor in their classrooms where they could control it. A lesson I learned from a student was, a PhD student, Greg Aced, was software does not get used, or at least the reading tutor, unless it is somebody's job to put the kid using the software. Something I learned from teacher training and professional development, what was important was not how to operate reading tutor. After all, it was designed for children to be able to use without adult assistance. What was important for teachers is to understand why to use, not how. In 25 years, I learned a whole bunch of lessons. I'll leave it at that for now.
I'd like to build on what you just said, Jack, which is that when we talked to some in last week's webinar on supporting teachers, which is that teachers don't necessarily have the professional training of how to make effective use of these technologies. And so they're inclined to just teach the way they taught before, but do it online. And this is one of the reasons why Zoom school runs into such limitations. People say, well, I'll just do my lecture online and it will be good enough. So what we really need is to provide training for teachers so that they know how to make best use of these technologies and how to help their students make best use of these technologies. Don't rely on the students to figure it out themselves.
Right.
Let's see, a question, has there been work on AI or other online learning programs for improving academic skills for students with language and learning disorders? I know some work that's AI helping students in the autism spectrum, and that's been very effective, helping people students to develop their communication skills in a safe environment. And I think that's one advantage that that AI-based systems provide, is that it does provide a practice environment where students aren't going to be embarrassed in front of their peers. Any other thoughts, responses to that point?
If I can just add on to that, people often ask, what about special ed? There's a methodological challenge to a study like the one that Sandra asked, and it has to do with N. Whenever you're trying to measure the effectiveness of learning, learning is slow, it goes over time, and measuring differences between two different learning things requires a lot of statistical power. So if your sample is limited from the get-go to a small subpopulation of students with language and learning disorders, you've got a much bigger challenge getting sufficiently N sample size and T duration of intervention.
But we are seeing systems that are overall being used for long periods of time and by increasing numbers of students. So things are trending in the right direction, I would say. So we're at the end of our time here. We'll have to close here. I just want to make sure everyone is aware. We are going to be taking part in a panel next month, July 8th, at the International AI in Education Conference, where we will be talking further about how AI can support teaching and learning under COVID-19. So please join that if you can. And also remind people that we will be providing a recording of this webinar on the website that you see here. So thanks again, everybody. It was a great conversation, and we'll talk more next month. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, Louis.
Take care.